I've always found peace in the solitude of nature. The dense forests of Washington have a way of wrapping you in silence, drowning out the noise of the world. It's where I've always gone to clear my head, to forget everything that's been weighing me down. After the breakup with Sarah, I needed that more than ever. So I packed my gear and headed out to the most remote spot I could think of, deep within the woods near Mount Rainier. The drive from Seattle was long, but it gave me time to think, to process everything that had happened. I kept telling myself this trip was exactly what I needed. No distractions, just me and the wilderness. But as I got closer to the forest, a strange feeling began to gnaw at me. It wasn't the kind of nervousness you get when you're about to do something new. It was deeper, like an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. I tried to shake it off. I've camped alone dozens of times before. This should be no different. When I finally arrived, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows between the towering trees. Forest was dense here, far from any trails or campsites, exactly the isolation I was looking for. I parked the car, grabbed my pack, and started the hike into the woods. Air was still, almost too still, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. The deeper I went, the darker it got. Even though the sun was still up, the thick canopy above swallowed most of the light, leaving only a faint, eerie glow to guide my way. Every snap of a twig under my boots, every rustle of leaves, seemed amplified, echoing through the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I set up camp by a small, secluded lake, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the fading light of the sky. It was beautiful, but there was something off about it. The place was too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my mind playing tricks after the long drive. But as night began to fall, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. The shadows seemed to stretch out towards me, like dark fingers reaching from the forest. And then, just as I was starting to settle down by the fire, I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost like it wasn't there at all, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. It sounded like it came from the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, straining to hear, but all that followed was silence. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, or maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something that didn't belong here, something that shouldn't be in these woods. I shook it off and crawled into my tent, hoping that a good night's sleep would clear my head. But as I lay there in the darkness, with only the thin fabric of the tent between me and the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the firelight, watching, waiting. I must have dozed off at some point, but my sleep was restless, filled with strange, disjointed dreams that I couldn't quite remember. I woke up with a start, the silence of the forest pressing in on me like a weight. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow that flickered against the tent walls. For a moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The only sound was the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off again, I heard it, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A whisper, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. But there was something off about it. It wasn't the natural rustle of leaves or the creak of branches. It was deliberate, like words carried on the breeze, just out of earshot. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the woods, from the darkness just beyond my camp. My heart started to pound in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind playing tricks on me, but the whispers persisted, weaving through the trees, closer now. I unzipped the tent slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the flashlight. The beam cut through the night, but revealed nothing, just the dark outline of trees and the still surface of the lake. The whispers stopped as soon as the light swept over the campsite, leaving only an eerie silence in their wake. "Get a grip, John," I muttered to myself, trying to laugh it off. The sound came out strained and hollow. I scanned the area again, every shadow seeming to twitch at the edge of my vision, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything, out there. Still, feeling of being watched lingered, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. I moved around the camp, pretending to check on the fire, But really, I was just trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. As I circled the small clearing, the whisper started up again, just behind me, following my every move. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but once again, nothing. Just the silent trees, the empty woods. My skin prickled with unease, and I could feel my nerves fraying at the edges. I forced myself to take deep breaths. Calm down. "It's just the wind," I whispered. But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The whispers seemed to taunt me, growing louder, more insistent. They circled the campsite, always just out of reach, always just beyond the firelight. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was wrong. It was like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear, something twisted and malevolent. I kept the flashlight on until the batteries began to wane, the light dimming into a dull glow. I didn't want to go back inside the tent, didn't want to be enclosed in the dark, but I couldn't just stand out there all night, jumping at every sound. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I crawled back into the tent, leaving the flashlight within arm's reach, the uneasy feeling settling deep in my gut. As I lay there, staring up at the tent ceiling, the whispers continued to play at the edge of my hearing, like a secret I was too afraid to uncover. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving behind the trees, felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was thin, brittle, filled with nightmares of being lost in those endless, whispering woods. I must have finally drifted off, though my sleep was anything but peaceful. When I woke, morning light was just beginning to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. For a moment, I felt a small surge of relief. Daylight had always been my ally, a way to push back the fears of the night. But that comfort evaporated the moment I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, the sky above a pale, cloudless blue. Everything seemed calm, almost serene, but there was an undercurrent of something wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the woods around me had shifted in some subtle, insidious way. As I moved towards the remnants of the campfire, I noticed it, something carved into the bark of the tree closest to my tent. My heart skipped a beat, chill running down my spine as I approached. The symbols were crude, jagged, as if someone had taken a knife and slashed them into the wood in a frenzy. They weren't there last night, I was sure of it. I ran my fingers over the rough carvings, trying to make sense of them. They didn't resemble anything I recognized. Not initials, not any kind of common symbol. They were just wrong. Uneven, almost chaotic, like the work of a mind on the edge of sanity. Quickly checked the other trees around the campsite, and to my growing horror, I found more of the symbols, each one carved deep into the bark. They circled my camp in a rough perimeter, as if they were meant to trap me inside, keep something in, out. My mind raced with explanations, each one more absurd than the last. Maybe they were old, made by some past campers, but as I examined them more closely, I realized that couldn't be true. The carvings were fresh, the wood beneath still pale and raw. Whoever or whatever had made them had done so during the night while I was sleeping just feet away. Panic started to bubble up, hot and suffocating. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Maybe it was a prank, some sick joke by other campers. But then I remembered how far off the trail I was, how remote this spot was supposed to be. No one else was out here. No one should have been able to find me. But someone did. I tried to rationalize it, calm the rising tide of fear, but it was like trying to hold back a flood. The symbols seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were more than just carvings, like they were warnings, or worse, invitations. My eyes kept darting to the edge of the clearing, where the forest seemed to press in closer now, the trees leaning in like silent sentinels. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before, and I couldn't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing there, hidden in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the trees, the symbols, and the oppressive silence that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. My thoughts spiraled. What if the whispers I heard last night weren't just my imagination? What if they were connected to these symbols, to whoever or whatever had been out there, just beyond the firelight? The idea that someone had been so close while I slept, that they could have been standing just outside my tent, sent a shiver down my spine. I needed to get out of here, to pack up and leave, for whatever was lurking in these woods decided to show itself. But as I started to gather my gear, carvings seemed to close in on me, their jagged lines burning into my mind. Each one felt like a mark, a sign that I was already too late, that I was already caught in whatever trap had been set. It couldn't stop my hands from shaking as I packed up my things, my eyes darting constantly to the tree line, expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my nerves fraying more with each sound. The forest, once a place of refuge, had turned into a cage, and I was its prey. As I shouldered my pack and prepared to leave, I took one last look at the symbols, those twisted, unnatural marks that now haunted me. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if they were alive, as if they were watching me. I turned away, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if I was never meant to leave these woods? What if whatever had marked the trees had marked me too? The sun was dipping below the horizon by the time I finally found a spot that felt far enough away from those cursed symbols. The unease that had settled over me all day had only grown worse with each passing hour. And now, as the last light faded from the sky, it was becoming unbearable. Every instinct screamed at me to keep moving, get as far away from this place as possible. The darkness was closing in too quickly. I had no choice but to set up camp again, even though every fiber of my being told me it was a mistake. I hurried to get a fire going, flickering flames the only thing keeping the oppressive night at bay. The trees around me loomed like dark, silent sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching out as if trying to pull me into the shadows. Forest was deathly quiet, not even a whisper of wind to break the silence. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a precipice, with something terrible waiting just beyond the darkness, ready to drag me down. As the last of the twilight disappeared, the whispers began again. This time they were louder, clearer, no longer just a faint murmur at the edge of my hearing. They were all around me, circling the camp like a pack of wolves stalking their prey. I could hear them distinctly now, fragmented words in a language I didn't understand, spoken in voices that were both human and something else, something that sent a chill straight to my core. I tried to ignore them, to focus on the fire. They wouldn't be ignored. They were in the trees, in the air, in my mind, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. I could feel them pressing in, as if the darkness itself was alive, closing in on me from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve screaming for me to do something, anything to break the spell that seemed to have fallen over the woods. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of it, and swept the beam across the trees, desperate to find the source of the whisper. But the light only seemed to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. Voices mocked me, growing louder, as if they were laughing at my fear. Then, just as I was about to collapse under the weight of it all, I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, barely visible in the gloom, stood a figure. It was tall, its body shrouded in shadow, its features indistinct. But there was no mistaking the fact that it was watching me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat as I stared at the thing, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, silently observing, as if it had all the time in the world. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, every instinct screaming at me to run. I couldn't move. I was trapped in its gaze, caught like a deer in headlights, powerless to do anything but stare back. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise dead silent night. As I slowly raised the flashlight, my hand trembling uncontrollably. I didn't want to shine the light on it. Some part of me knew that whatever I was about to see would be worse than anything I could imagine. But I had to know. I had to see. I flicked the beam of light towards the figure, and in that instant, vanished, just gone, as if it had never been there at all. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I didn't care that the forest was pitch black, or that the only thing guiding me was a half-dead flashlight. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever was stalking me. My mind was a blur of terror and adrenaline as I threw my pack over my shoulder and plunged into the woods, leaving the dying fire behind. The trail, if you could even call it that, was barely visible under the thick canopy. The darkness was suffocating, the beam from my flashlight barely cutting through the inky black. Every step felt like it was leading me deeper into a nightmare, but I forced myself to keep going, to keep moving. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, as if it was alive, as if it was trying to trap me within its twisted depths. The whispers followed me, no longer distant or faint. They were all around me now, echoing off the trees, growing louder with each step I took. What had once been a soft, unsettling murmur had transformed into distorted, mocking voices that twisted and warped in the darkness. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but the intent was clear. They were enjoying this. They were enjoying my fear, my desperation. I stumbled over roots and fallen branches, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. The forest seemed to be closing in on me, the trees leaning in closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, trying to pull me back, trying to drag me down. The path, which had seemed so clear when I arrived, was now a maze, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Every time I thought I was heading in the right direction, trees would shift, the ground would tilt, and I'd find myself going deeper into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their tones dripping with malice. They were inside my head now, filling my mind with images of things I didn't want to see. Twisted faces, dark eyes staring out from the shadows, blood on the ground. I could feel them crawling under my skin, tearing at the edges of my sanity. Shut up, shut up. I screamed into the night, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The whispers only laughed, their distorted voices intertwining in a cacophony of madness. They were enjoying this. Whatever was in these woods, whatever had carved those symbols and stalked me through the night, was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every step I took. I had no idea where I was anymore. The trees all looked the same, twisted and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy so thick that not even the moonlight could break through. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive, that it was shifting and changing around me, leading me deeper into its heart, further away from any chance of escape. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind carried those horrible voices, twisting them into something unrecognizable. My flashlight flickered, beam wavering as the batteries started to die. I was running out of time. I could feel the forest closing in, the darkness thickening around me, suffocating me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, flitting between the trees, just out of reach of the failing light. My heart nearly stopped as I realized it wasn't just one shadow. There were dozens, maybe more, moving in the periphery of my vision, surrounding me, hunting me. I stumbled, nearly falling as my foot caught on something. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground, the light dimming to almost nothing. I scrambled to pick it up, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but when I looked up, the shadows were closer. They were closing in, surrounding me on all sides, cutting off any hope of escape. The voices were a roar now, deafening, filling my mind with their twisted, mocking laughter. Couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Forest was alive with their presence, a malevolent force that had lured me in and was now ready to claim me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just knew I had to keep moving, had to get away from those shadows, from the voices that were tearing at my sanity. The trees blurred as I sprinted through the darkness, the ground uneven beneath my feet, branches clawing at my face, my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. But no matter how fast I ran, the shadows followed, always just behind me, always just out of reach. I could feel them breathing down my neck, feel the cold presence of something far worse than I could ever imagine, something that wanted me, that needed me to feed its insatiable hunger. And then, just as I felt like I couldn't go any further, like my legs would give out and I would collapse into the waiting arms of the shadows, forest opened up. I stumbled into a clearing, the trees falling away like the walls of a prison finally giving way. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The whispers stopped, the shadows retreating to the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't an escape. This was just the beginning. For a moment, I thought the clearing was my salvation, a brief reprieve from the terror that had been stalking me through the night. But as I lay there, gasping for breath, the reality of my situation began to sink in. The trees around the clearing formed a perfect circle, their twisted branches intertwining above like a canopy, blocking out the sky. It felt more like a cage than a refuge, trap disguised as safety. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, trembling beneath me. Every muscle ached, my body screaming at me to rest, give in, but I couldn't. I had to keep moving, had to find a way out. But as I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, I realized with a sinking dread that there was no path, no trail leading back to safety. Forest had swallowed up the way I had come, leaving me stranded in this circle of trees with no sense of direction, no hope of escape. Panic clawed at my chest, and I spun around, desperate to find some way out, some hint of where to go. But the trees were too thick, their shadows too deep. Every direction looked the same, a wall of darkness pressing in on me, mocking my fear. And then, the whispers started again. They were different this time. No longer distant, no longer teasing. They were right there, all around me, a chorus of voices that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath my feet. They weren't just whispers anymore. There were screams, wails of torment and despair that tore through the silence like a knife. I clapped my hands over my ears, trying to shut them out, but it was useless. The voices were inside my head, filling my mind with images of death and decay, twisted bodies writhing in agony. They were the voices of the damned, the lost souls who had wandered into this cursed place and never found their way out. And now, I was one of them. My vision blurred as the voices grew louder, more frantic, overlapping in a cacophony of madness that drowned out all rational thought. I stumbled back, away from the center of the clearing, my back hitting the rough bark of a tree. The touch of the wood was cold, too cold, and I recoiled as if burned. That's when I saw it. The shadowy figure was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a fleeting glimpse, a trick of the light. It was real, almost solid, its form dark and indistinct, but unmistakably human in shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisted, head cocked at an unnatural angle as it stared at me with eyes that I couldn't see but could feel. The voices grew louder, more desperate, as if they were trying to warn me, trying to tell me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a fear so profound it felt like my soul was being torn from my body. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence sucking the warmth from the air, leaving me shivering in the cold. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, get as far away from this thing as possible. My legs wouldn't obey. I was trapped, pinned under the weight of its gaze, unable to tear my eyes away as it drew closer, its form becoming more defined with each step. The shadows clung to it like a shroud, obscuring its features, but I could sense the malevolence radiating from it, the sheer hatred that poured off it in waves. It stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could feel the cold emanating from its body, could hear the ragged, unnatural breath rattling in its chest. My heart pounded in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I waited for it to make its move, for it to end this nightmare once and for all. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching me with those unseen eyes, as if it was savoring my fear, feeding on it. The voices had become a deafening roar, a maelstrom of agony and despair that threatened to tear my mind apart. But I couldn't look away. I was trapped, not just by the figure, but by the knowledge that I was completely, utterly alone in this hellish place. Then, without warning, the figure reached out, its hand, or what passed for a hand, extending towards me. It moved slowly, almost gently, as if it was offering some kind of twisted comfort. The air around me grew colder, the shadows deepening, swallowing the last of the light. I wanted to scream, to cry out, but my voice was lost in the din of the voices, drowned out by the chorus of the damned. The figure's hand was inches from my face now, the darkness swirling around it like a living thing. And in that moment, I knew. I knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to kill me. No, it was going to take me. And then, just as its fingers brushed my skin, everything went black. When I came to, the world around me was different. The suffocating darkness had lifted, replaced by a dull, gray light that seeped through the trees, I was still in the clearing, but everything felt wrong. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the trees, once menacing and alive, now stood like the rotting remnants of a forgotten graveyard. I pushed myself up, my body trembling, every muscle aching as if I had been fighting for hours. My mind was foggy, disoriented, but the terror from before was still there, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. Figure, the shadowy thing that had reached for me. It was gone, but the sense of dread it left behind was stronger than ever. I tried to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what had happened. The memories were jumbled, fragmented. All I knew was that I had to get out, had to escape this cursed place, for whatever had attacked me came back. But as I stumbled towards the edge of the clearing, something stopped me. A sound, soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't the whispers this time. Something more tangible, more familiar. Voices, human voices, mingling together in a low, mournful chant that sent chills down my spine. They were coming from all around me, from the trees, from the very earth beneath my feet. I turned slowly, scanning the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw them. They were faint at first, barely more than shadows at the edge of my vision. But as I stared, they became clearer, their forms solidifying into figures, human figures, twisted and broken, their faces contorted in pain and rage. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all standing silently among the trees, their eyes fixed on me with a burning intensity that made my blood run cold. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. These weren't just shadows, weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real, spirits, ghosts of the dead, drawn to this place by something far darker than I could comprehend. And then, in a sudden, horrifying moment of clarity, it all came back to me. Years ago, I had come to these woods with friends, a group of us, eager for adventure, for escape. We were young, reckless, and we didn't care about the warnings, the stories of strange occurrences in the forest. We laughed them off, convinced that we were invincible, that nothing could touch us. But we were wrong. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a weekend getaway. Something went terribly wrong. The details were hazy, blurred by time and denial. The truth was undeniable. There had been an accident, a fire, spreading through the camp faster than we could react. Panic, screams, and then nothing. When it was over, I was the only one left. I had blocked it out, buried the memories deep in my mind, convincing myself that it wasn't my fault, that it was just a tragic accident. But now, standing in this cursed clearing, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, truth hit me with the force of a hammer. Spirits. They were my friends. The realization knocked the wind out of me. The faces that had been twisted in rage and pain began to take shape, features becoming familiar. There was Tom, with his ever-present smirk, now twisted into a grimace of agony. Sarah, her bright eyes now dark and hollow. And Jake, who had always been the strong one, now looking at me with an expression that was equal parts sorrow and accusation. They were all here, the friends I had lost, people I had abandoned in that fire, and they were angry, not just at the accident, but at me, for surviving, for forgetting, for moving on, while they were trapped in this hellish place, reliving their deaths over and over. The figure I had seen, the shadow that had hunted me through the woods, it wasn't just one entity. It was all of them, fused together by their pain, their hatred, their need for vengeance. They had become something monstrous, something driven by a singular purpose, to make me pay for what I had done. No, I whispered, backing away, my mind reeling. This can't be real. It wasn't my fault. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But the spirits didn't care. Their faces twisted into expressions of pure rage, and they began to move towards me, their forms shifting and melding together into a single, towering mass of darkness and despair. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get away, had to escape, but the clearing seemed to stretch on forever, the trees moving further and further away with each step I took. The air was thick with their anger, their voices rising in a deafening roar that filled my mind with their pain, their hatred. And then, just as they were upon me, everything stopped. The spirits froze, their forms flickering like a candle in the wind. For a brief moment, the rage in their eyes softened, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like sorrow. I felt a jolt of recognition, a memory surfacing that I had tried so hard to forget. The night of the fire, the moment when I realized I was the only one left. I had run, leaving them behind, thinking only of saving myself. I had survived, but they had paid the price. Tears filled my eyes as I looked at them, the friends I had abandoned, the people I had loved. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the spirits wavered, as if my words had reached them, had touched something deep within their tortured souls. But then, just as quickly, the rage returned, and they surged forward, their voices rising to a fever pitch. I turned and ran, the darkness closing in around me, the forest coming alive with the sound of their screams. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, I knew the truth. I couldn't escape them. Not this time. I ran, blind with fear, the darkness swallowing me whole. The forest was alive now, trees shifting and closing in, the shadows reaching out like twisted claws. The spirits were behind me, their voices a deafening chorus of rage and despair, their presence pressing down on me like a suffocating weight. Every step was a struggle, every breath a gasp as the world around me distorted, the familiar path twisting into something alien and terrifying. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how desperately I tried to escape, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only getting deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to move with me, the ground shifting beneath my feet, leading me in circles, drawing me further away from any hope of salvation. It was as if the woods themselves were conspiring against me, trapping me in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The voices grew louder, their words twisting into a grotesque mockery of my own thoughts. They whispered my name, over and over, 1,000 voices merging into one, filling my mind with images of the past, of that night, of the fire, of the faces of my friends as they screamed for help that never came. I stumbled, falling to my knees, my hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. The air was thick with the stench of rot, the smell of death hanging heavy in the air. The shadows around me danced and writhed, forming shapes, figures that reached out for me, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the roar of the voices. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But there was no mercy in their eyes, no forgiveness in their hearts. They had waited too long, suffered too much. Their pain had festered in this place, their anger feeding on the darkness, growing stronger with each passing year. And now they wanted their revenge. The ground beneath me began to shake, the earth splitting open as the shadows closed in. I could feel the cold fingers of the spirits brushing against my skin, pulling me down, dragging me towards the gaping maw of the earth. The air was filled with the sound of their screams, their voices merging into a single, agonized wail that pierced through me like a knife. I tried to fight, pull away. My strength was gone. My body was numb. My mind shattered by the horror of what I had done, of what I had become. I could see their faces now, twisted and broken, their eyes burning with hatred, with a darkness that consumed everything in its path. And then, just as the darkness was about to swallow me whole, everything stopped. The world around me fell silent, the voices fading into the distance, the shadows retreating into the trees. I was alone again, the forest once more still and silent, as if nothing had happened, as if the nightmare had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. But I knew better. I knew that the darkness was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to claim me. I staggered to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. Clearing was gone, replaced by a dense, impenetrable forest that stretched out in all directions, endless and unforgiving. There was no path, no trail to follow, only the darkness that loomed all around me, pressing in from every side. I took a step forward, then another, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I tried to find my way out. But the forest was a labyrinth, the trees closing in on me, the shadows growing darker with each step. And then, in the distance, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to run. But my legs wouldn't move, my body paralyzed by fear as the footsteps grew closer, the sound reverberating through the darkness. And then I saw it. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall and dark, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the same figure I had seen before, the one that had haunted my dreams, the one that had hunted me through the night. But this time it was different. This time it was real. Stepped closer, its form towering over me, its presence suffocating. I could feel the cold emanating from it. See the darkness swirling around its body, as if it were made of the very shadows that surrounded us. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was trapped, helpless, as the figure reached out for me, its hand closing around my throat, its grip cold as death. The world around me began to fade, darkness closing in, the last of the light disappearing as the figure pulled me into the shadows. And then, everything went black. The next day, when the search party found the campsite, there was no sign of John. His tent was still there, his belongings untouched. But the clearing was eerily silent, the air heavy with a sense of unease. The trees around the campsite were marked with strange symbols, carved deep into the bark, symbols that no one could explain. But the most chilling discovery was John's phone, found lying in the middle of the clearing, its screen cracked and covered in dirt. The battery was nearly dead, but when they played the last recording, their blood ran cold. It was John's voice, trembling and broken, whispering in the darkness, "They're here, they're all here, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." And then, as the recording neared its end, there was a sound, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. The sound of voices whispering John's name over and over, chorus of the damned, their voices merging into one, filling the air with their pain, their anger, their hunger. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving only silence, the phone's battery finally dead. To this day, no one knows what happened to John. The forest near Mount Rainier remains a place of mystery, a place where the locals say you can still hear the whispers at night, if you listen closely enough. They say that on quiet nights, when the wind is still, you can hear his screams echoing through the trees, a reminder of the darkness that lingers there, waiting for its next victim. And the legend of John's disappearance lives on, a ghost story passed down from generation to generation, a warning to those who dare to venture too deep into the woods. But the truth, the real truth of what happened that night, is something that will never be known. Only the forest knows, and it isn't telling. I glanced at my tent, considering just calling it a night, retreating to the safety of the thin nylon walls. But even that seemed futile. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something a tent could protect me from. The fire was burning low, and as much as I wanted to add more wood, I didn't dare leave the circle of light. The night was alive with sounds now. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, those cursed whispers. I tried to convince myself that it was just the forest, just nature doing what it always does when the sun goes down. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be, and it was getting closer. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see by as I cooked my dinner. I was stirring a pot of something simple, canned beans maybe, when the feeling hit me like a cold gust of wind. I was being watched. At first, it was just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone had their eyes locked on me from the shadows. I paused, spoon mid-air, and slowly scanned the tree line. The forest was still. The darkness beyond the campfires glowed impenetrable. But the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more insistent, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just nerves. Maybe I was jumpy from being out here alone, or maybe it was the eerie quiet of the place. But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, the sensation wouldn't go away. It felt like a pair of unseen eyes were drilling into me, watching my every move, studying me from just beyond the edge of the light. I set the spoon down, my hand trembling slightly, and stood up. Forest around me was a solid wall of black, the fire the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I squinted into the trees, straining to see any movement, any hint of a figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the silence, heavy and oppressive, wrapping around me like a shroud. But the feeling wouldn't leave. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, watching me with 1,000 invisible eyes. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel sweat starting to bead on my forehead, despite the chill in the air. Every instinct was screaming at me to do something. But what? Run? hide? There was nowhere to go, nowhere to escape. I turned back to the fire, trying to focus on the simple task of finishing my dinner. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I looked up, I expected to see something. Face, figure, anything, lurking just beyond the circle of light. But each time there was only the darkness, vast and empty. Paranoia was eating away at me, making it impossible to think straight. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there, something that didn't want to be seen, and it was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The paranoia was eating away at me, making it impossible to think straight. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there, something that didn't want to be seen, and it was watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend like everything was normal, but it was useless. The feeling of being watched was so intense, so overwhelming, that I could hardly breathe. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, set my heart racing. I was caught in a nightmare of my own making, and there was no waking up from it. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were closing in around me. My eyes darted back and forth, desperate to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. The darkness had swallowed everything, leaving me alone with the terrible certainty that I wasn't alone at all. And then, just for a split second, I thought I saw something. Flicker of movement, pale shape darting between the trees. But when I looked again, it was gone, leaving me with nothing but the fire and the ever-present feeling of those invisible eyes, watching, waiting. Midnight came, and with it, the kind of darkness that swallows the world whole. The fire outside my tent had burned down to little more than embers, casting a faint, dying glow, barely penetrated the thick night. I was huddled inside my tent, the fabric feeling pitifully thin, like a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was out there. The feeling of being watched had never left, but now it was accompanied by something far worse. Sounds. At first, it was subtle, just the occasional snap of a twig or the soft rustle of leaves. But as the minutes dragged on, the noises grew louder, more deliberate. The heavy crunch of footsteps, slow and methodical, circling the campsite. It wasn't the random scurrying of an animal. This was something purposeful, something with weight. I strained to listen, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps would stop for long stretches, leaving me in a silence that felt even worse. Then they'd start again, closer this time, moving in a wide arc around the tent. I held my breath, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself, to step into the dying light. But it stayed hidden, just beyond the reach of my vision. My hand gripped the knife I'd brought, the metal cool and solid in my sweaty palm. I kept telling myself I'd be fine, that this was just some animal, maybe a bear or a deer, curious about the camp. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. No animal moved like this. No animal circled a campsite so deliberately, so silently. Whatever was out there had intelligence. It was stalking me. I peered through the small opening of the tent, trying to catch a glimpse of the intruder. But the night was an impenetrable void, thick and endless, swallowing up everything beyond the faint glow of the coals. My eyes strained against the dark, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the thing that was toying with me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive blackness and those heavy, deliberate footsteps. The fire was almost out, the last embers flickering weakly, and I knew I should go out and add more wood. The thought of stepping outside, of leaving the thin safety of the tent, was too much. I couldn't do it. The footsteps were too close now, the sound of them grinding into the dirt echoing in my skull. They stopped directly behind the tent, just a few feet away, and I froze, barely daring to breathe. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, my fingers tightening around the knife until my knuckles were white. Then, the footsteps started again, moving slowly, methodically around to the front of the tent. I wanted to shout, to scare whatever it was away, but my voice had died in my throat, placed by a cold, paralyzing fear. I could see the outline of something now, just on the edge of the dying firelight, a vague shape, tall and hunched, moving just outside the tent. It stopped, and I could almost feel it staring at me, its unseen eyes boring into the thin fabric. My entire body was trembling, every instinct screaming at me to run, to do something, but I was trapped, held captive by my own terror. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance, leaving me alone in the crushing silence. I waited, every nerve on edge, expecting it to return, to pounce. The night remained still. The only sound, the faint crackle of the last embers. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. I just sat there, knife in hand, staring into the dark, waiting for the nightmare to begin again. I must have drifted off at some point, though I couldn't say when or for how long. The night outside the tent felt endless. Thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to seep into my bones. But then something yanked me back to consciousness, something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. It was the silence. The footsteps had stopped hours ago, or maybe just minutes. I couldn't be sure. But now there was a stillness that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I could hear nothing but the faint crackle of the dying embers, and even that seemed too loud, too sharp in the void. I lay there, knife still clutched in my hand, staring up at the tent's ceiling, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that whatever had stalked me earlier was back. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, in the corner of my eye, I noticed it. The dim light of the fire, just barely illuminating the edge of the tent. And beyond that, something else. A shape. It was there, just at the edge of the firelight. Pale, emaciated figure, standing impossibly still. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, every muscle locking in place. The figure was tall, unnaturally so. Its skin, a sickly, almost translucent white, seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Its limbs were too long, too thin, hanging at odd angles, like it didn't quite know how to use them, but it was the face that paralyzed me with terror. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, were deep, hollow pits, blacker than the night itself. They bore into me, staring directly at the tent, directly at me, with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Its mouth was a thin, dark line, pulled tight across a skeletal face, twisted into something that resembled a grin but was far too wide, far too unnatural, to be anything remotely human. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away, unable to even blink. The figure stood there, motionless, its gaze locked onto mine. I could feel something radiating from it, an overwhelming sense of dread, something ancient and malevolent. This was no mere creature, no animal of the woods. This was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. But it didn't walk or run. It simply vanished, as if the darkness itself had swallowed it whole. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, leaving nothing behind but the lingering impression of those hollow, staring eyes. For a long time I couldn't move. I just lay there, heart pounding in my chest, staring at the spot where the figure had stood, half expecting it to reappear, come rushing out of the shadows. But the night remained still, fire now little more than a faint glow, barely keeping the darkness at bay. When I finally found the strength to move, it was only to pull the sleeping bag tighter around me, the knife still clutched in my hand. Sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, its empty, soulless eyes. I didn't know what it was or why it had come, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had to get out of these woods. And soon, because whatever that thing was, I was certain it wasn't done with me yet. Hours that followed were a waking nightmare, a blur of panic and dread that twisted my thoughts into knots. The figure never showed itself again, but its presence lingered, seeping into the very air around me. I could feel it, just out of sight, lurking in the darkness, waiting. The fire had all but died, leaving me alone with the oppressive blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The noises started again, faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground, as if something massive and unseen was moving just beneath the surface. My breath hitched, my body tensing with each new sound. Branches snapped somewhere in the distance, the sharp cracks echoing through the still night. And then there were the whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that drifted through the air like a sinister lullaby, too low to understand but impossible to ignore. They were close, so close that I could almost feel the breath of the unseen voices against my skin. I pressed my hands over my ears, desperate to block them out. The murmurs only grew louder, more insistent, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. The tent felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around me, trapping me with whatever horrors lay outside. I don't know how long I lay there, curled up in a ball, my knife clutched uselessly in my trembling hand. Time lost all meaning. Minutes felt like hours, hours like days. The noises outside continued, a relentless barrage of growls, snaps, and whispers that battered at my mind, unraveling my thoughts. I tried to focus on something, anything, to ground myself in reality, but my mind was slipping, sliding into a chaotic abyss of fear and confusion. Every rustle of leaves, every faint crack of a branch set my heart racing. Couldn't tell what was real anymore, couldn't trust my own senses. Shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting into grotesque shapes that danced just beyond the edge of my vision. The whispers morphed, taking on the tones of voices I recognized. Friends, family, all calling to me, pleading with me to come out, to join them in the darkness. I knew it was a trick, cruel manipulation, but the part of me that still clung to reason was slipping away, drowned out by the overwhelming terror that consumed me. I started to wonder if I was alone in the tent after all. The space around me felt too crowded, the air thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel pressing in on all sides. My skin crawled with the sensation of invisible fingers brushing against me, cold and clammy. I jerked away, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to escape. The tent had become a prison, claustrophobic box that held me captive in my own spiraling madness. I tried to force myself to stay awake, keep my eyes open, but exhaustion was creeping in, the adrenaline that had kept me alert now draining away, leaving me weak and disoriented. My thoughts were a jumble, incoherent and fragmented. I couldn't tell if the whispers were real or just echoes in my mind. Couldn't distinguish between the sounds outside and the noise in my own head. It was all blurring together into one endless, suffocating nightmare. And through it all, one thought kept circling in my mind, growing louder with each passing minute. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. Something was here with me, something that had crawled out of the darkness, something that had taken hold of my mind and wasn't going to let go. As the first faint light of dawn began to creep through the fabric of the tent, I was a trembling wreck, barely clinging to the last shreds of my sanity. The noises had finally stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse, a hollow, echoing void that seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't tell if the figure was still out there, couldn't even be sure if it had ever really been there at all. But one thing was certain. The darkness had changed me, it reached inside me and twisted something fundamental. And as the light of day slowly returned, I knew I would never be the same. The horror of the night had burrowed deep, leaving me haunted, broken, and forever marked by whatever it was that had watched me from the shadows. The first light of dawn was a sickly, pale gray, filtering through the tent's fabric like a weak, dying thing. It should have brought relief, but instead, it only heightened the terror gnawing at my inside. The noises had stopped, but the silence felt worse, unnatural, suffocating, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I couldn't stay there any longer. The tent, the campsite, everything about this place felt wrong, tainted by the horrors of the night. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to unzip the tent. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was charged with malevolence. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for me as I hurriedly began to pack up. My movements were frantic, desperate. I tossed everything into the truck with no care for order or organization, just a primal need to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this cursed place as possible. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me jump. My heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The sense of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it had grown stronger, more intense, as if the unseen eyes were closer now, almost brushing against the back of my neck. I didn't dare look around. I couldn't bear to see if something was standing in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake, let my guard down for just a moment. The minutes stretched into eternity as I fumbled with my gear, every nerve screaming at me to move faster, faster. The sky was growing lighter, but the dawn brought no comfort, only the sharp, icy edge of fear that drove me to the brink of panic. Finally, with everything thrown into the back of the truck, I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking fingers. The keys slipped from my hand as I tried to start the engine, and I cursed under my breath, the fear rising in my throat like bile. When the engine finally roared to life, I didn't hesitate. I floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as I sped down the narrow, winding road that led away from the campsite. But as I drove, the sense of being followed only grew stronger. I could feel it, something unseen but very real, keeping pace with the truck, moving through the trees with an unnatural speed. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white, my eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, anything, chasing after me. And then I saw it. The pale figure, standing at the edge of the woods, just visible in the rearview mirror. It was exactly as I had seen it before, emaciated, hollow-eyed, and unnervingly still, watching me with that same intense, soul-piercing stare. But this time, there was something different, something worse. The grin was wider, more pronounced, as if it knew something I didn't, as if it was pleased with what had happened. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't look away, couldn't tear my eyes from that horrible, ghostly visage. The truck swerved dangerously close to the edge of the road, and I jerked the wheel, my heart pounding in my ears. When I glanced back at the mirror, the figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all. But I knew better. It had been real. Just as real as the terror that still clung to me, that would follow me no matter how far I drove. The road stretched out before me, winding through the dense forest, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, pursued by something that didn't belong to this world. As the miles rolled by, the dread settled deep into my bones, a cold certainty that no distance could ever be enough. The figure was gone, but it had left its mark on me, a scar that would never heal. I could still feel its eyes on me, even now, boring into the back of my mind. Constant reminder that I had crossed a line, that I had seen something I was never meant to see. I knew I would never truly escape. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment when my guard was down, when my strength was gone. And when that moment came, when I was at my weakest, I knew it would find me again. And this time, there would be no escape. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight, decaf.